The showroom smelled like new paint and promises. Ivan Parker stood in front of the salesman with his hands still dirty from 3 days of harvest, looking at a case 1370 that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Then, the dealer leaned against the hood. "That old 1370 you've got out there, the one your neighbor traded in? Keep it running if you want to go broke." Ivan didn't say much. He never did. But he was calculating. A new machine like this one would cost $31,400. Financed over 10 years, that was a monthly payment that never sleeps. The old iron had cost him nothing to acquire. But the dealer was right about one thing. It was going to cost him everything to fix. 30 years later, Ivan Parker bought the land that dealership sat on. Now, to understand why that dealer was so sure the old 1370 would bankrupt him, you have to look under the hood. The machine arrived at Ivan's farm in 1975 with high hours on the odometer, the kind of high that made mechanics wince. The previous owner had run it hard, pushed it past what the engineers intended, and kept pushing. The turbocharged 504 diesel was already tired. You could hear it in the knock. The 12-speed power shift transmission had play in the clutch packs. Every shift felt loose, felt wrong. And the hydraulic seals throughout the system were weeping. Not failing yet, weeping. That's the sound of a machine counting down. The dealer's math on repairs wasn't fantasy. A turbo rebuild alone ran $800, maybe $1,000. Transmission overhaul? Another $3 to $4 grand, easy. Hydraulic seals throughout a 34.5-gallon system? $2,000 more. You'd be in the $8,000 to $12,000 range before you'd clean the first injector nozzle. But Ivan's math was different. A new Case 1370 was $31,400. Over 10 years at the rates the bank was charging, that was a monthly payment that never slept. 30 years of farming, paying principal and interest while the machine depreciated. Debt doesn't care if the machine breaks down. Debt cares about the note. So Ivan did something the dealer didn't expect. He bought the old iron anyway. The first night in the shop, Ivan pulled the injection pump. The diesel smell filled the air. That sharp, burnt metal smell that never leaves your hands. The pump came free with patient persuasion, not force. Inside, the fuel nozzles were carbon-fouled black. Years of poor combustion. But they weren't broken. They were dirty. Salvageable. He spent the next 8 hours soaking them in kerosene, scrubbing each nozzle with a brass brush. The carbon came off in layers. By midnight, the nozzles were clean enough to fire again. $500 of work done for kerosene and his own time. The real choice, Ivan understood by hour 3, wasn't between old iron and new iron. It was between debt and sweat. Between signing a note that owned you and owning your own time, even if that time was spent under the chassis of a machine that wouldn't die quietly. But keeping that iron alive would mean something he didn't expect. Something that would change 30 years. See, the thing about old iron is it teaches you a language. Not words. A language of tolerances and failures. Every time something broke, Ivan learned to read what the brake was trying to tell him. By year 2, the pattern was clear. The 1370 would fail, but never all at once. It would whisper first. A knock in the diesel. A hesitation in the shift. A small puddle under the hydraulic manifold. And if you listened, if you paid attention, you could diagnose before the machine seized. The hydraulic system was the first real teacher. A Case 1370 runs 34.5 gallons of hydraulic fluid through lines and seals pressurized to 2,050 pounds per square inch. That's not a gentle system. That's pressure trying to break free. The seals wear. They weep. Then they fail. Ivan learned to bleed the system himself. To replace the wet disc brakes without the dealer's bill. To feel when the remote valves were sticking and how to free them with patience and a wrench he'd inherited from his father. The turbo was another education. A turbocharged diesel has a sound right before it goes wrong. It's a high whistle that changes pitch, gets thin, desperate. Ivan learned to hear that sound at 3 in the morning while he was trying to sleep. Learned it meant he had maybe a week before the turbo would eat itself. He couldn't afford a turbo rebuild. That ran into serious money. So he nursed it. Kept the RPMs down on hot days. Let it cool between field runs. Extended a piece of iron that should have been junk by years just by understanding what it was trying to tell him. The shop sessions became his second life. 2 in the morning. The smell of diesel fuel and metal shavings. His hands too cold to grip the wrench properly. but gripping anyway. His son sometimes there now, watching, asking why the transmission needed bleeding when it looked fine to him. Because, Ivan would say, you can feel it before you see it. The emotional cost wasn't on the balance sheet. Missing family dinners because the 1,370 seized in the field. Missing his daughter's school play because the wet disc brakes glazed over and he had to replace the pads before the next morning. Missing whole weekends in the shop while his wife sat alone in the house, knowing that one wrong move under that machine meant the whole season was gone. Then came the harvest of 1982. Midfield. The transmission locked. Dead stop. Not a slip, a seizure. Ivan had 48 hours to get that machine moving again, or lose the entire crop to an early freeze. The prediction was already in the forecast. He drove to the barn at sunset, looked at the 1370, and knew exactly what had happened. Hydraulic lock in the power shift. The clutch packs had welded together under load. He bled the system by hand. Worked until his fingers went numb. Used a hose and a valve he'd rigged up years before for exactly this kind of emergency. Freed the clutch pack by midnight. Got the machine limping back to the barn by dawn. The fix cost him a borrowed pump and his own labor, but it kept the season alive. And here's what the dealer never understood. Every repair kept Ivan tied to that iron, tied to the shop, tied to the work. But it also kept him free from the bank, free from the note that owned you while you slept, free from the monthly payment that never forgave you for anything. Not a breakdown, not a poor harvest, not the simple fact of being human and needing rest. Most farmers would have signed the note and walked away. Ivan stayed in the shop instead. Meanwhile, the dealership was selling a different story. The 1970s were the golden age of the sales floor. New iron arrived every month, gleaming under lights that made the paint look like liquid. The dealer wasn't selling tractors. He was selling relief. No more breakdowns. No more nights in the shop. No more machines that wouldn't start on cold mornings. Just climb on, start the engine, and work. The financing made it simple. 0% for 60 months on case iron. Trade in your old machine, get credit toward the new one. The math looked clean on the paper the salesman put in front of you. 5 years of payments, then you owned a brand new machine. Compare that to Ivan's math. 8 to 12,000 in repairs on a machine the bank didn't own. The dealer understood economics, volume, turnover, predictable monthly payments flowing in from dozens of farms. If a farmer broke a transmission, that farmer came back to the service bay. If he needed a new hydraulic pump, the dealer sold it to him. The dealership made money on both ends, on the sale and on the repair. It was a machine itself, in its own way. Ivan watched the neighbors sign the notes. One by one, they traded in their worn machines for the new iron. Their farms looked updated, professional. The showroom became the center of agricultural life in the county. New Case 1370s arrived like promises. The dealer's son went to college on the back of those sales. But Ivan was watching something else. One neighbor, Dale Hutchins, bought a new 1,370 in 1977. Paid cash for part of it, a good harvest the year before, and financed the rest. $14,000 on a note. By 1979, at only 2,000 hours on the machine, the transmission started slipping. Not gradually. One day it shifted fine. The next day, it was loose, hunting for gears. Dale brought it to the dealership. The service manager told him the truth. The transmission needed a complete overhaul. $6,000, parts and labor. Dale asked if it was covered under warranty. The manager said no, not on transmission work. Not at 2,000 hours with that kind of use. The fine print had protected the dealership, not Dale. So Dale paid $6,000 to fix a machine that was still financed. He was still making payments on a tractor that had already cost him half a year's profit to repair. The dealership made money on the sale, made money on the repair. Dale lost both ways. Ivan heard Dale tell this story at the feed store, heard the resignation in his voice. That resignation was the sound of a man who understood too late that he'd signed away his options. That was the moment Ivan saw the real geometry of the dealer's promise. The dealer wasn't lying about the old 1,370 bankrupting him. The dealer was right about one thing. An old machine costs money to keep running. But the dealer had assumed Ivan would pay that cost to the dealership, in the service bay, with interest built in. What the dealer didn't expect was someone willing to pay the cost to himself, in the shop, at 2 in the morning, with nothing but sweat and time and the refusal to sign a note. The showroom was bright and clean and smelled like new leather. The shop, Ivan's shop, was dark and cold and smelled like diesel and rust. But one of those two places was trying to own you. The other was the place you owned yourself. By the early 1980s, Ivan had seen enough neighbors climbing into debt to understand the real cost of the dealer's promise. It wasn't about machines at all. It was about ownership. Who owned the iron? Who owned the land? Who owned the farmer? The dealer owned the future. Ivan's future, for now, still belonged to him. By year 5, that 1370 had stopped being a machine Ivan kept alive. It had become something else, a teacher. And not just about engines. The diesel knock was the first language. A good knock, rhythmic, healthy, meant the fuel was igniting properly. But Ivan learned the variations. Knock that changed when the throttle opened meant carbon buildup in the cylinder heads. Knock that came and went with temperature meant the injection timing was drifting. He could sit in the cab with his eyes closed and hear the machine's story before the gauges told him anything was wrong. The turbo whistle was another dialect, that high-frequency scream that most people ignored. Ivan didn't ignore it. He learned the pitch that meant healthy boost, the pitch that meant the compressor housing was about to fail, the thin, desperate whistle that gave him maybe a week before catastrophe. He'd spend extra time in the field on those weeks, running easy, letting the machine breathe, coaxing it through, like talking to something alive. The transmission became a study in feel. His hands on the shift lever taught him to sense when the clutch packs had play, when hydraulic pressure was dropping, when a synchronizer was wearing. Most farmers didn't develop that sensitivity. They didn't spend enough time with one machine long enough to learn it. They traded in, got new iron, never stayed long enough to speak the language. Ivan stayed. By 1980, his son Michael was old enough to follow him into the shop. Michael was maybe 10 years old, small enough to fit under the wheel wells, curious enough to ask questions without end. Ivan would have his hands in the machine, and Michael would be there, watching, asking why the hydraulic remote worked the way it did, why you needed to bleed air from the system before the brakes would grip, why you could feel a bearing getting ready to fail before you could see it. One evening, Ivan remembers this clearly, they had the 1370 running smooth in the barn. Michael was asking about the injection pump. Why did Dad have to rebuild it by hand instead of just replacing it? Why not just buy a new one? Ivan shut the engine down and wiped his hands on his pants. He looked at his son and said something he'd never quite put into words before. Because if you replace parts, you never learn the machine. The machine owns you. But if you rebuild it, if you understand why it broke and how to fix it, then you own it. And when you own it, you own everything it can do for you. Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked another question, and another. And Ivan realized he wasn't just keeping a machine alive anymore. He was passing something down. A way of seeing. A way of thinking about tools and time, and the difference between owning something and being owned by something. The tractor stopped being a burden. But the cost was something Ivan didn't talk about much. His marriage strained. His wife spent nights alone while he was in the shop. His health started going, early arthritis in his hands, his back hurting from laying on cold concrete for hours. The shop work never stopped. There was always another seal weeping, another system needing attention, another small failure preventing a large one. He was building something for his son, a legacy of skill, a way of thinking about machines and responsibility. But he was building it at a cost to his present that his wife was paying more of than he was. He didn't know it yet, but that old 1370 was about to become worth more than the land it sat on. Not to a dealer, not in a showroom, but to him, to his son, to everything they'd both learned in that cold shop, speaking the language of diesel and metal. Then the 1980s arrived, and everything changed. Commodity prices collapsed. Corn dropped to $2 a bushel. Soybeans fell apart. The farm economy that had been humming in the 70s seized up like a transmission with no oil. Interest rates spiked to 15%, then higher. Banks were drowning in defaults. Farmers who'd signed notes back in 77 and 78. Farmers who'd bought new iron with 0% financing and promises that the equipment would pay for itself were now sitting on machines they owed more money on than they could make in a season. The dealership felt it first. The farmers who'd bought new Case 1370s stopped coming in, stopped trading up. The service bay, which had hummed with work, started having empty bays. Trade-ins piled up on the lot, machines that farmers had financed but couldn't finish paying for. The dealer's business model, built on volume and turnover, cracked. Arlo Vance, the dealer who'd told Ivan the old 1370 would bankrupt him, started offering desperate deals. New machines at prices that didn't make sense. Financing on equipment that should have been sitting in inventory for months. The showroom became a clearance center. The bright promise faded. Ivan's position was different. His Case 1370 was now more than 10 years old. High hour. The turbocharged 500 Ford diesel had been rebuilt twice. The transmission had been overhauled. The hydraulic seals replaced so many times he'd lost count. On paper, to a banker, it was a liability. A machine that should have been scrapped a decade ago. But it was completely paid for. No note. No monthly payment. No debt sleeping beside him at 3 in the morning. The farm was producing less, like every farm. But Ivan was producing something else. Knowledge. He'd learned where every failing point was before it failed. He could extend the working life of machines most mechanics would have called junk. Other farmers started asking him to look at their equipment. Started bringing him machines to keep alive. He took on repair work on the side, fixing neighbors' iron in his own shop. Small money, but clean money. Money that didn't come with a banker's signature. Then a banker showed up at the farm. Ivan knew what was coming. The bank was circling. Farm after farm, they were calling in notes. If you couldn't make the payment, they wanted collateral. They wanted the land. The one thing you couldn't replace. The banker sat in Ivan's kitchen and told him what he'd told a dozen other farmers that month. The bank would forgive part of the debt if Ivan put up the acreage as collateral. Ivan didn't say much. He never did. But he said no. The land wasn't collateral. The land was the foundation. Everything else, the machines, the equipment, the work, was built on it. You lose the land, you lose the right to fix anything. You lose the reason to keep anything alive. The banker left, but the pressure didn't. Meanwhile, the dealership was crumbling. By 1985, Arlo Vance was selling inventory at a loss just to keep the lights on. The showroom that had gleamed with possibility was now half empty. The service bay was quiet. Trade-ins nobody wanted sat on the lot, depreciating daily. Ivan watched from a distance. He wasn't gloating. That wasn't his way. But he was watching the geometry of the 1970s flip inside out. The dealer had been right about repair costs. Dead right. But wrong about who could carry them. Wrong about what breaks a farmer and what holds him together. By the early 1990s, something unexpected was happening. The dealership went under. Not suddenly. Slow, like a machine losing pressure. Arlo Vance couldn't carry the inventory. Couldn't move the used equipment piling up on the lot. The bank that had financed the dealership's own operations called in the note. The showroom closed. The service bay went quiet for good. The land went to auction. Ivan showed up. He didn't bid high. He didn't have to. Nobody wanted farm real estate in 1991. The soil was there. The location was solid. But the future wasn't. He walked out of that auction with the deed to the land the dealership had sat on, a few acres of cleared ground where the showroom had gleamed, and the satisfaction of a man who'd refused to play a game he never believed in. The Case 1370 was still running, still pulling. Now it was a relic, officially obsolete by every calculation in a parts catalog. But it was alive, and that mattered more than anything on a balance sheet. Michael was running the farm now, late 20s, had spent his whole childhood in that shop, could rebuild a transmission in his sleep, could hear a bearing go bad 3 weeks before it seized. He didn't see the 1370 as old iron anymore. He saw it as a backup machine, something reliable, something that wouldn't quit when you needed it most. Ivan did the math one winter evening, just to see. The 1370 had cost him roughly $15,000 in parts and labor over 20 years. Everything. Turbo rebuilds, transmission overhauls, hydraulic seals, diesel fuel. His own sweat, he didn't count, because that was just the price of keeping something alive. A new Case 1370 in 1978 cost $31,400. Financed over 10 years at the rates the bank was charging, somewhere around 9 to 11%, the total cost was well over $40,000. That was principal and interest. That was debt that didn't sleep. Ivan's neighbors who'd signed those notes back in the 70s had paid $40,000, $50,000, maybe more. Then they'd watch the market collapse. Watch their machines become liabilities. Watch the dealer go out of business while they were still making payments on equipment that was now worth a fraction of what they owed. Ivan had paid $15,000 and owned a machine, and the land the dealership had been built on. The real value wasn't financial, though. Not really. Michael understood machines. Not just how to fix them, but why they failed. Why tolerances mattered. Why a hydraulic seal weeping in July would become a catastrophic failure in August if you didn't replace it. He understood systems. Understood that you could extend the life of iron by understanding it, not by replacing it. He didn't inherit debt. He inherited knowledge. The 1370 sat in the equipment shed now, paint faded, tolerances worn thin, but still reliable, still pulling. Every time Michael took it to the field, he was carrying forward something that no monthly payment could ever buy: the ability to keep things alive. The confidence that you could solve problems without asking a bank for permission. The showroom was gone. The service bay was gone. The bright promises had evaporated. But the old iron remained. And the land remained. And the skill remained. Passed from a man who refused to sign a note to a son who learned in a cold shop that sweat and patience were worth more than credit. The dealer hadn't been evil. He'd just been selling what the system demanded. Progress, relief, new iron. But the system was built to extract, not to endure, to turn machines into debt, to turn debt into ownership, to own the farmer, not the farm. Ivan had seen that geometry from the start, and he'd spent 30 years refusing to play the game. The old 1370 sits in the equipment shed now, next to machines 50 years newer, parked on land that used to be a dealership. Paint faded, tolerances worn, still running, still reliable. The dealer was right about repair costs, but wrong about what breaks a farmer. Drop a comment. Would you have signed that note, or would you have stayed in the shop?